Right, I think we're going to get going. We're missing Byrne, but he is going to be here soon. So that is fine. We'll pop him on at the end and hear what he has to say. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Johnston. I am Politico's London influence reporter, covering everything from lobbying, public affairs, transparency, and helpfully money in politics, which is what we're here to discuss. Really delighted to be asked to do this. It's one of my favourite things to talk about, weirdly, which is probably a bit nerdy, but it's great. So, on the panel here, we have Duncan, Director of Policy at Transparency International, Sue Hawley, Exec Director at Spotlight on Corruption, and Ed Hodgson, Deputy Director of More in Common. We're going to have a bit of a presentation on some brand new polling, which is very helpful, from Ed, and then we will get into the proper discussion. And I'm going to make time for questions at the end. Start thinking about them now. If they're boring or if they're speeches, I'm going to ignore them. So you've had your warning. I know what this crowd can be like. Ed, over to you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk through some polling that we've done with Transparency International on sort of attitudes to some of these issues. But I think it's worth taking a step back first and looking at sort of how the public see our politics at the moment more broadly and where the broader issues are. We use for all of our polling the 7 segments. Some of you will have seen it. People always ask us how they find out the segment there, and you can do a quiz on our website. But this is a segmentation where we've divided the country through this massive poll of 20,000 people into segments, not looking at their demographics, but looking at their attitudes and worldviews. So when we do this segmentation in the UK, we come up with these 7 segments, and they go from progressive activists on the very left, who are sort of exactly who you might imagine. This is the group who care a lot about social justice. They're very politically engaged. They're actually the only group who say they like talking about politics. Then you've got the incrementalists left, who share a lot of the same values, but they're not so political. They're actually quite disengaged from politics. They're quite happy with the status quo. They're pro our institutions, but they're worried about things like increasing division and actually corruption in society. I won't go through these all now, but if you sort of skim and glance your eyes across to the other side, you've got rooted patriots, who are sort of your red wall swing voters. They voted for Boris Johnson in 2019, they voted for Labour in 2024, and now they're overwhelmingly against for Reform UK, whereas dissenting disruptors are much more solidly the Reform base. These are the voters who Labour would be foolish to chase after because they're never going to vote Labour. They are very much behind Nigel Farage and Reform UK. And if you have a look at some recent sort of voting intention polling, you can see this more clearly. Rooted patriots is a very clear swing group. By the way, they're very sceptical of our elites and institutions and concerned about things like corruption, as are, I should say, a lot of these segments. In fact, we do lots of polling on some very divisive topics like immigration and climate change, and the segments can be really useful in those for showing, oh, actually there's quite different attitudes across society on something like immigration. On something like this, you'll see some graphs in a moment. It's one of those ones where you don't see divides, and actually all of these segments, for different reasons, care about transparency and corruption. So it's worth sort of stepping back and looking at trust in Britain more generally. Trust is at an all-time low, as I'm sure many of you will know, and it's not just in politicians, it's in news journalists, it's in big business as well. People do tend to trust judges, scientists, and their neighbours, importantly, although you'll see that varies a lot by segment. These dissenting disruptors, for example, much more sceptical of judges than any of the other segments. Hence sort of the appeal of the more populist language around judges there. But you see this is not a polarising issue. People don't trust politicians, kind of regardless of their politics in the UK. This is a graph from the election last year, but this shows that disillusionment is not just confounded to people sort of swinging to reform. So this is sort of slightly convoluted graph, but it shows you Labour constituencies, Conservative constituencies, SNP constituencies, and the Dem constituencies. You'll see, even in seats that Labour held, the incumbent lost their vote share. So even though Labour won the election very, very conclusively, they were losing votes in the seats they held. There's a clear sense of disillusionment with all of our politicians and all of our parties, and that's sort of being visible at the ballot box. I think this graph is quite striking as well. The majority of people now will say, or almost the majority, I should say, just under, will say that Britain's system of government is not a genuine democracy. And actually, only 17% strongly agree that Britain's system of government is a genuine democracy. That's really worrying. It's established liberals who are sort of our blue wall Cameronite Tory group are generally the most trusting, and they're more likely to trust our politics, but even among them, a significant chunk, or only a third, will say that Britain strongly agree that Britain is a genuine democracy. All the other groups, you get much more scepticism. I should say it's actually progressive activists and dissenting disruptors who have very different political views. They're the most sort of distrusting of our democratic system. And then we have this word cloud, which has not changed too much in the last few years that we've asked this question. How do you describe the UK in a word today? Broken overwhelmingly comes to the top. And this is not just to do with distrust in our politicians, it's public services not delivering for people, it's cost of living, it's rising bills. But it's a sense that politicians aren't listening to their concerns and aren't taking them seriously. And it makes people even more sceptical of politicians when they see scandals about corruption and lack of transparency. And this is the last one on the general mood, and we'll come on to the specific polling, but people don't think our politicians are up to the challenge. Here we have, the government does not have things under control. And this is an interesting sort of lack of agency that we see across all of our polling. People feel in their own life they don't have things under control, and they don't see the government as sorting things out. And this data was almost exactly the same in the previous Conservative government, so the change of government has not fixed that. So that's the gloomy picture. So one more sort of tied to this specific issue. People think that if you're rich, you're taken more seriously by politicians. I think that will surprise people. But time and time again in focus groups, people will say, you can't trust politicians on anything. And I should say it undermines confidence on every issue. So I personally do lots of polling and research on climate change. And when we talk about electric cars, people don't trust that the transition to electric cars will be fair because they say that, oh, politicians are just doing it to sort of get rich off electric cars. They think they're sort of in the pocket to electric car companies. And this trust is pervasive across loads of issues like that. Even you've seen with digital ID, the rise of sort of conspiracy about different companies being involved in that, really sort of making it much more harder for the government to pursue changes they want to pursue because there's such lack of trust in politicians to do things transparently and openly. So here's some polling we've done for this event. This is some good news, really. Trust in the Electoral Commission is pretty high. Here we've asked you to choose between two statements. In red, we've got elected government ministers should be able to influence electoral regulations by themselves, and in blue we've got basically the Electoral Commission should be able to do that independently. And across all the segments, just about, the majority of people say it should be done left to the Electoral Commission. And you'll see that spans sort of traditional conservatives who are quite a high trust segment, they trust our institutions, to dissenting disruptors, who are the segment that Reform are speaking to, saying we need to tear down a lot of these regulating authorities. But now there is pretty high trust in them, although I should flag with caution that grey in the middle of the people who don't know, that's sort of ripe for the taking for anyone who wants to spread a more sort of populist argument undermining an organisation like the Electoral Commission. Those people could be swayed, and I guess it's up to a lot of people in this room to try and make the case to them, but we need to protect the independence of those organisations. And then we've asked sort of what might increase or decrease their trust in politics. A lot of people are in grey, their trust is so low that these things would have limited impact on their overall trust in politics. But if we were to ban, for example, if we were to ban MPs going on all expensive trips overseas, for half the country that would increase their trust in politics. Which is quite a meaningful number given how low trust is. It's a small change but would significantly improve the situation for people. And I should stress that's not important just because trust in politics is important in itself, but it's important because when politicians are trusted, they can pursue more ambitious policies elsewhere, like I mentioned earlier. Similarly, banning MPs from having second jobs has a similar level of support in terms of how much it would increase people's trust. So there's things that can be done. Just to end on a slight challenge, having said that opportunity. So the opportunity is that people want this stuff. They don't think that politicians are currently acting sort of a lot in good faith. They think that there's lots of corruption in politics. They perceive it, and they would like more transparency and they would like tighter rules. The challenge is that trust in politics is so low that if an option, and this is a small challenge, but if a solution to this involves sort of increasing public spending for political financing to try and dissuade people from some of the political donations, that's going to be taken with a lot of scepticism from the public. So there needs to be a way to sort of, because trust is so low, manage the transition to a more fair, transparent system in a way that builds trust. rather than sort of taps into where people are already sceptical of the government. So that is the end of my slides. But yeah, I should say, in sum, this is an issue where there's lots of opportunities for politicians to be seen to be doing the right thing. It's also an opportunity where the government could quite easily draw quite a clear wedge with Reform UK if they were willing to sort of implement policies properly and call out reform on it. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Ed, and hello, Liam. Lovely to see you. Just to give, I guess, a little bit of context to those figures as well, the Conservative government massively increased the spending limits for elections, which kind of didn't really get much pickup, actually, outside in the kind of wider community. But the effect of that has been that there is a massive rush to try and get money in order to be able to run elections, to win elections. You need to have a lot of cash. And as we've seen, that means that more big donors are being relied upon to do that. I actually spoke to a new Labour MP, if we can still call him new, this week, and we were speaking about this. He had a message from a lobbying company offering to run a fundraising dinner for him before he was back home from his count. The votes were counted, he hadn't gone to sleep, and he had a message from a lobbying company offering to do a fundraising dinner. So there's obviously some big issues to be dealt with here. We have had the elections bill from the government, which is going to be coming in the next couple of months. We're going to see more on that. What I'd like to do is start with you, Sue, and just maybe talk us through the bits that are in there, but also the gaps that you sort of see, or where we still need clarity from the government on how some of it's going to work.
Yes, thanks, John. So the government laid out its electoral strategy. We don't actually know the detail of the bill, but it's a promising start. There is actually some good stuff in there that people have been calling for a while, like tightening up corporate donations, greater transparency of unincorporated associations, and increasing the Electoral Commission's powers. So at the moment, it can only fine parties £20,000 maximum. So, taking example, it's been in the news lately, £700,000 worth of donations, was it, to Labour Together, and it was a £14,000 fine. So we're talking about, fines that really, not even the cost of doing business. They're not, people really wouldn't care very much about that. They might care about the reputational damage. So those are good things, and there's some, other increases to the Electoral Commission. But it's not enough. The threats and the challenge is huge, as you've talked about. The public trust is so low. The risks of that lack of trust being manipulated by foreign actors is really high. We know that Russia's been going around giving out money to political parties, $300 million in 24 countries between 2014 and 2022. We've had 2 Intelligence and Security Committee reports talking about, Russian and Chinese state actors trying to give foreign donations. So it really is, it's a real problem, and we need the ambition to match the problem, basically. And the electoral bill, at the strategy level, wouldn't be enough to match that ambition. So I'll just give you 3 tests that we have, but I think there'll be more that other panelists will want to talk about. One is, the most disappointing thing we've all expected Labour to do was to overturn what the last one did, which was create the ability to actually set the policy and strategy. The Electoral Commission is a major incursion on the independence of the electoral body. And in opposition, Labour really opposed this. Constitutional experts like Alan sitting over there said this is really unconstitutional. Breaches 8 different international standards on having an independent electoral body. We've seen the UK drop from 15th in the world to 49th in terms of the ranking to its independence, its electoral body as a result of that, introducing that power. So, it's actually really, really problematic, and I don't think, if you look at what's happening in the US and if you look at what happened happening in Hungary. You know, the first thing authoritarian governments do is try to neuter their electoral body so that they can maintain power. So it's a real risk, and we have to persuade Labour that, you know, that this is actually something we have to tackle. Maybe talk about saying, no, the Electoral Commission has operational independence, but as long as the government of the day can set the strategy and policy of the Electoral Commission, it is not truly independent. So that's one. The second is you really need criminal enforcement of official financial risk is almost zero. I mean, it's really, really just hopeless. And we really need a very clear criminal offence, is what law enforcement have been asking for, to make sure that you can't give a donation via a gift from overseas or from process of crime. So it's not illegal in the UK to give a donation that comes from your ill-gotten gain. So you could be a mafia don and happily donate. And so at the moment, the legal community are not convinced by the proposal that the government has come forward with for tackling that, and they think it needs to be stronger and much clearer. And also, we need this, you know, the last government took away the Commission's power to actually do criminal enforcement, and there is no real police force that stepped up to do it. So we need a specialist unit that is going to tackle that. And I think there are emerging threats. I'm sure we'll come to this in discussion. I'm sure that Liam will be keen to talk about it. Crypto donations. You know, we have to have you know, a prohibition on any crypto that doesn't come from highly regulated firms regulated in the UK, and that actually where it's fully transparent about the money, and there must be very clear rules about it. It would be easier to ban it altogether. You know, we know crypto has been behind 3 major Russian influence operations in US elections. You know, $100 million worth of crypto has been used in Moldova. So we really need to tackle that. And just finally, another area is massive spending that happens outside the periods that parties have to report on. And until we have spending limits that actually cut across the whole kind of on an annual basis, rather than just in the run-up to elections, because otherwise parties can just front-load a lot of their spending, pump a lot of money in, and then look like they're not spending very much.
Duncan, I want to come to you because one of the things that we see time and time again in polling is when people are making these big donations, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of pounds, the polling is very clear that people believe they are doing that so they can have more influence over the government or the party. The election bill doesn't touch that at all, which I think in your words means we still have this wild west around our sort of election finance rules. Do you think there's any appetite for the government to look at that? Or, you know, also the other issue that I know Transparency International raised is about lowering the spending limits again. Do you think it's realistic that, having already raised them, that there's any way back down?
Thanks, John. Well, you're right to raise the spending limits. There's been something of an arms race going on, but the limits were raised so far under Rishi Sunak that actually, without opposition of any material sense from the Labour Party at the time, that none of the political parties bumped into that limit at the last election. And that was a really expensive election. You know, about £100 million was spent, way more than we've seen in the past. And in 2023, the political parties were filling their war chest for that election. We saw that 2/3 of all the private donations to the political parties came from just 19 mega donors who between them gave over £50 million. So that's an awful lot of the fuel going into these campaigns coming from a very small number of people. And even if we go back to the EU referendum, each of the sides in the EU referendum were able to cover the permitted costs of the elections, the short referendum campaign period, with just their 10 largest donors each. So you in this audience, as people at a Labour Party conference, may be used to receiving lots of appeals to support a political party of your choice. But the reality is the vast majority of the money is coming from a small number of very centralised sources of finance. So I'm not surprised that we see the kind of polling results that we heard earlier, and it's not just more in common, but earlier this year Opinion had a very similar figure. 63% of Britons think that the very rich have too much influence on politics. So of course one of the ways in which in the eyes of the public this is evidence is when they see very wealthy people who have by that point given millions of pounds to the Conservative Party, subsequently being given a seat for life in our Parliament in the House of Lords. And frankly, there is a bit of a collective shrug inside the Westminster bubble when this happens. Kemi Badenoch just last month pre-briefed to the Times while everyone was on their summer holidays who she nominated to enter the House of Lords. There was a eye-catching former Olympian, high-profile figure on that short list, but also on that list was the Treasurer of the Conservative Party, who I think has now given them £5 million, and she wants him to go to the House of Lords. And I think there is a tendency in the Labour Party to look at this problem and say, can't you see this is what the Tories are up to, not us, we're better than that, you can trust us, and allow this to, if you like, be something which people might compare. But that's not actually what polling like this tells us. Polling like this tells us is when the public see this sort of thing, they don't differentiate, they just think it stinks. And actually, Keir Starmer's the Prime Minister. He could turn around and say to Kemi Badenoch, and he should, I see what you're doing here, I'm not having it. Come back with a different nomination, and we can go ahead, right? And that would be a very clear way to say that, things have changed. And we understand the public think this stinks. And not only are we not going to do this, we're not going to allow you to do it either. And just one last note on these big governors. If you read the Democracy for Sale newsletter, you'll know that since the Reform Party was constituted in 2019, 4/5 of its funding has come from just 5 mega donors. Harborne, Hosking, Lilly, Cottrell and Richard Tice. So between them, they have given the Reform Party £17 million. So this is not something which is a phenomenon clearly in just one political party. And of course, you may have heard over the summer Nigel Farage making the case that he wants to put a lot of people in the House of Lords before very long himself. So I understand why the public thinks this stinks. The elections bill is an opportunity to do something about this, but we have no limit whatsoever on how much any one person can give a political party in any one year in this country. Leaves the door wide open. So everything else that we try to police, and we're going to hear more about that from Liam, I'm sure, just becomes so much more high stakes when there is no limit whatsoever. And I think it'd be a very sensible move to take this opportunity to pull time on that.
Liam, I want to ask you about crypto. Reform, have said that they would accept crypto donations. I know that you've said that they should be entirely banned from the political finance system. The problem is everything else is wide open too. We have unincorporated associations, almost no transparency. We're going to get a little bit more in the elections bill, but not a huge amount. Companies, again, slightly being tightened up, not probably as far as is needed to give the public transparency about it. Why do you think crypto is so dangerous that it should just not be allowed in any form?
John, thank you. So let me come to that point with a little bit of a run-up, and I just wanted to start with a word of thank you to Duncan and the other folks here from TI, Spotlight, Foreign Policy Centre. And if you don't subscribe to Democracy for Sale, Peter is here and he can point you to...
T-shirts are.
That is like a must-read for everybody in this room. So there are kind of sort of 3 pieces really of this puzzle that I just wanted to share before I conclude the answer to your question. So one is just to appreciate the scale of money. And what we should be looking at when we think about the scale is not just the money that is going into the bank account of a political party. We should actually be looking at what has now become the media political complex. And just to give you a sense of that, the work that we've done for a book that I've got coming out in March on populism, we tracked in 4 years about 150 million. 150 million in 4 years going into the media political populist system. So that is the scale of it. So it's not simply the money that is going into reform, it's the money that is going into media systems, which is then pouring through into the bank accounts of politicians. So one, think about the scale of what we're up against. 155 million in 4 years, that is an awful lot of money. And it kind of explains quite why reform feels like it's as strong in a way as it is. Second, we have to now track the evolution of the sources. So, when we were contesting the Brexit referendum, there was pretty clear evidence of involvement in Russian intelligence services. There was actually a division in Russian intelligence services about whether this was wise or not, but actually, just look at the court case that we've heard about this week, you can see the level of influence. This is a clear tactic now to try and divide the rule. But one of the reports that Peter pointed me to at the beginning of the summer is that although Russian intelligence services now find it difficult to fund in the way that they did, there are other forces. So the CIA thinks that Russian intelligence services will bring in about $30 million a year. Actually, the new report that has come out in the European Parliamentary Forum at the beginning of the year shows about 30 million coming from the Christian right into a network of ideological organisations trying to roll back gender-based rights, reproductive rights. So again, you've got different kinds of dark money now coming in, and then as Duncan said, you've now got this intense concentration of money. So if you think about that 155 million that I just mentioned, overwhelmingly that comes from 4 people: Paul Marshall, Christopher Chandler from Legarton, Christopher Harborne, and Jeremy Hoskins. Now, is it an accident that many of those individuals are based in financial services, or they are market traders, or they are people who profit not just from political volatility, but from volatility in financial markets? I don't think it is. Is it an accident that half of them are offshore? No, I don't think it is. So, we are allowing our politics to be completely bought and sold by people who don't have the common good as their principal interest, and who half the time aren't even based in the country. So we've got to look at the way that this money is coming in, so the kind of controls that have been talked about, unincorporated associations, and that sort of thing, incredibly important. We are going to have the nerve, I'm afraid, to start looking at the way we today have algorithmic amplification of hate, and that delivers ad share revenues to politicians who are serving in the House of Commons as well as others. Look at how much money was made by hate preachers on Twitter in the wake of the Southall riots, stoking division, stoking hate, profiting from that. And then finally, we've got to basically deliver an outright ban on cryptocurrency. We know that Russian intelligence services are now thinking about cryptocurrency as their preferred mode of transferring money, not directly to parties, but to Western proxies who can then go on and obviously to donate. But the key thing is, you cannot enforce against it. So you cannot police it. And right now we have a hard enough problem enforcing the current rules we've got, never mind allowing a wash of new money that is completely untraceable. So unless the elections bill outright bans cryptocurrency donations when it is presented, then frankly we are going to leave our democracy open to be bought and sold by the people who are already innovating in creative new ways to prosecute the kind of politics of authoritarianism, appeasement, and avarice. And so there is an awful lot at stake, but the good news is we have it within our power to actually take action against this over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. So let's not miss the chance.
As our Labour representative, I'm going to have to ask you this one. But
Is it about Andy Byrne?
we can get on to that. You obviously didn't see the polling, so you'll have to trust me on
Andy
this.
Byrne joke. I'll say that afterwards.
Two of the biggest things that came up that would sort of increase political trust in sort of our political system was independence of the Electoral Commission and the regulator, and potentially capping donations. Labour very strongly opposed the move by the Conservative government to take away the independence from the Electoral Commission. Now they're in power, they're not touching donation caps, and they haven't gone back on the Electoral Commission independence issue, which they were so upset and aggrieved about. Why?
I don't know, but I mean, there will be a strong market amongst colleagues in the PLP to take on both of those issues. I think the one note of caution I would sound is that if we think that those two issues are going to restore trust in politics, then we're going to be sorely disappointed. A bit like the good folks at More in Common with Best for Britain and YouGov, we've been working on some segmentation of the tribes of reform that we published at the end of last week. And actually, amongst those hardcore reform voters, there is such a profound sense that politics is broken that I don't think we're going to reverse that. But the other kind of insight, I suppose, is that amongst the particular part of the Reform Coalition, there is a profound sense that the market is rigged against them, that there is no such thing as a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, that the only way to succeed in this country now is to be born into a family that is rich and powerful. And these are people who, of course, don't merely experience the reality that hard work doesn't pay, but hard work hasn't paid. So, their living standards are under acute pressure, they're living in precarious communities, they're profoundly pessimistic about the future, furious about immigration, and they think politics is profoundly broken, which is why they're prepared to roll the dice on leaders who they sense are known quantities. And so ultimately, unless we can kind of roll back the divisive inequality that now divides our country, we're not really going to restore any sense of faith that democracy can deliver. One of the first bits of polling I did that started me off down this track, some work I did with the Fairness Foundation and Policy Institute 2 or 3 years ago, and we basically asked people what was it that they feared from rising inequality. Number one, undue business influence on government. Number two, rising risks of corruption. And of course, they're absolutely right. That is what happens when you get profound levels of inequality, because you get a spillover of that economic inequality into the political system. I've been a member of Parliament for 21 years now. I have never seen big money strike the corridors of power in Westminster like I see today. And that, I'm afraid, is part and parcel of the rising levels of inequality that we've got. So, look, I agree with the arguments that have been made about the things that are priorities for the elections bill, but ultimately, until we actually start delivering for people who have had just, the most appalling time over 20 years of austerity, then we're not really going to restore faith that politics works for ordinary people, because you know what? People have failed.
So I want to come back to you on the elections bill. There's obviously quite a lot of technical detail still to be worked out. We didn't have a democracy minister for quite a while, 6-7 weeks at least. Now we do have a democracy minister. Also has the brief for fire, which is make of that what you will. How have you found engagement with the government on this bill? Like, are they listening to outside groups like yourselves, experts, on how to really make the bits they have put in there work properly?
Well, I would say we've had some minimal engagement with the civil servants who are drafting the bill, but that we haven't had a huge engagement from politicians on it. I think that actually cuts across quite a lot of the ethics and integrity agenda. So, like, something we talked about, John, a new ethics and integrity commission created without any consultation at all with any groups that work on anti-corruption or even, in the kind of government and constitutional space. So I think it's, it is disappointing. And I do wonder, and this is a challenge to you, Liam, actually that kind of thing of feeling like your voice isn't heard. I think last year there was a lot of enthusiasm for what are the ways to really bring people's decision making into government? How could we use citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, something Gordon Brown talked about. They only work if they're not symbolic and actually feed meaningfully into policy, like you see in Ireland. But the longer government is left, the more ambitious the solution we almost need for it to cut through. And I think, so I think there's a whole level of, engagement that could have happened, not just with the groups who are working on this, but more broadly with the public. And I think if we're going to win some of the arguments, you're not going to win to cut to Ed's point about the public funding. You might not win that in a poll, but actually if you had a proper reasoned debate with experts coming to talk to you about what are the benefits, how the costs are low compared to the benefits, you might actually get some really interesting discussions with people. And you might, as long as it feeds into actually changing policy, it might make people feel more heard and more precise that we're talking about.
One of the other bits I report on is around public affairs and lobbying, and there's been calls forever to improve the lobbying register and the legislation there. One of the things that actually seems to have cut through with politicians is the fact that there are so many other examples out there across the globe of where this is done really well. Duncan, is there sort of international examples, systems where this stuff actually sort of works, doesn't disrupt the political system, but sort of can have that, build that trust with people? Is there sort of other countries out there that you'd point to as better examples of how to do this?
Yes. So on the worst case scenario, you've got the US as a poster child, where a decision called Diversity Citizens United guarantees under freedom of speech the ability to spend as much of your money as you like on politics. But in Canada, there is a donations cap that's worth about £1,500 a year. In Australia, the Labour government, led by Prime Minister Albanese, just before their re-election, brought forward legislation to cap donations in Australian federal politics. That legislation didn't apply at the last elections. The last election in Australia was fought without donation caps, but with a Labour government going into that election having legislated for donation caps, and so that will be the case for future elections. In South Australia, at the state level, they've now banned private donations to political campaigns, and their first election on that basis, so they do have public funding of political parties for those elections, will be in, I think, March of next year. It's not impossible to do, right? Other English-speaking democracies with shared heritage to our own have grasped this nettle. And in the case of Labour in Australia, even though it did involve also an element of public funding, didn't get in the way of a Labour government being re-elected. So this is not in that drawer, which is just too difficult. But I think part of the problem here is that our politicians are conflicted because they are part of this system, and that makes it harder for them to view these policy questions entirely objectively.
Liam, I want to ask you something, and then we're going to come to questions. Because it's incredibly nerdy and fun, I've actually created an inbox and signed up to all of the fundraising emails from all of the different parties, and there's a lot. And I often look at them and think, Labour's asking me for £5, but I've just looked in the Electoral Commission search and you've just had £1 million from someone else. Do you think there's a risk that for ordinary members, especially Labour members, look at it and say, do you know what, why should I bother? Why should I sort of, and it's such an important bit, people who donate to parties feel more connected, get more involved, feel that they have a little bit more ownership of what's happening. I mean, is there a risk there that sort of general members just become completely turned off from getting involved in that side of the party because there's so much big money for it?
So I don't think there is, oddly enough, because I think actually where more members are more inclined to give now is to their local party or their local MP or their local councillors or for their local campaign. So, I mean, I suspect that my party is like most parties now. We've always been a very hyper-local party. We have always had in our CLP far more debates about bins than we have about any matter of national policy. I suspect that my party's not alone in that, and so I suspect when we're doing fundraising work, people are much more inclined to give local, because all politics is becoming hyper-local now. But it's, what I find interesting about this is that in the polling that we've done, amongst, again, populist voters, 80% feel that they have no agency to change what's going on in their local community. And actually, that's not massively different from the GB average. I think the GB average is about 75%. So, back to kind of Susan's point, really, there really is a sense that people do not have any power and influence over what is happening outside their front door. And so, the government has, I think it's fair to say, somewhat lacked a public service reform agenda for the last 12 months. I'm a bit like that. But the advent of the new pride in place funding is really, really significant. And for those of us who have been playing around with deliberative democracy techniques at a local level for some years, this actually opens the door for us to be engaging with people in a completely new way about actually what kind of streets do you want in the park? Where should the traffic calming go? What is the right time for the PCSO to be outside the school? When should people be putting their bins out? Because these kind of techniques are much more powerful on practical questions than they are on big esoteric questions like should we bring back hanging? So just like, but here is a chance to kind of rejuvenate people's sense of agency over the immediate environment that they live in. And I think actually, when we think about restoring democratic traditions, sure, let's think about the nation, but in truth, we'll make a heck of a lot more progress just changing what's going on in your postcode.
Yeah, now I've got some bad news for you. There was a recent case decision about national versus local campaign expenditure. And the decision was that in a local election, you could still deploy national campaign expenditure that wouldn't be in any way constrained by the local election campaign limits that your activists adhere to. And Reform were not the only party in the local elections this year who, as a result, deployed national campaigning at some expense that was not constrained by the limits that we currently have on election spending. And so if you have a letter, say from Nigel Farage, addressed to an individual voter in a council area that has an election, but that doesn't mention his council candidates, that needn't go against those candidates' election expenditure terms. So I think what we might be about to see is, certainly in terms of campaign expenditure activity, the kind of politics that you were celebrating being absolutely swamped by national campaign messaging, and we won't have long to wait to see what effect that has next year.
So I'm sure that's true, but in terms of actually unlocking the agency of individual members, I think that is much easier to do on a local level than asking people to contribute to a national campaign where people don't actually feel agency. This notion of powerlessness and agency is something that is really underappreciated in explaining the rise of populism, I think. So probably Duffy has just done some really good polling on this stuff. But people, you've got to try and restore people's sense of control and agency about what is going on outside their front door first, I think.
Right, I want to come to you guys for some questions. Just stick your hand up. One there, we've got a mic coming in.
Thanks. Steve from Democracy. I've written a lot to you about the sort of threats and overseas influence in our politics. You even said that we're allowing our politics to be bought and sold by people who don't have common good at heart. The spectre of Elon Musk hangs in the air. But at what level? The obvious way to deal with that would be a donations cap, as we discussed. What donations cap would be the level, the way of dealing with that, but at what level should it be set? And yet, sort of simultaneously, given the crisis of trust ahead sets out, how is the public going to feel about the prospect of public funding, which is possibly the inevitable consequence of a cap if you set it at a low level? So, how do you reconcile those two things?
Do you take that one on there?
So I think it's really difficult. I mean, it's a bit like immigration caps, right? So, any politician seeking to set a cap on immigration would end up with a number that was just so far from what public thought was the right number, that you would end up being condemned for it. So I think you can't detach the need for a donations cap from many of the other changes that are needed, because the money at the moment that's coming into politics like water. So you dam up one channel and it just pours in through the other. And so unless we're getting quite serious about regulating payment from algorithms, or getting serious about money coming through the media system, or getting money through cryptocurrency, I think we've got to try and do our best to sort of seal the maximum expanse of the wall rather than simply getting the donations cap. And I think people probably got a realistic sense of that too. So whatever number you pick the donations cap, I don't think people are going to be convinced by that unless you can show that you're plastering the rest of the wall as well.
Like Elon Musk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I remember at the time when there was all those news headlines about Elon Musk's potential donation to reform and all those images of Farage standing next to Elon Musk and sort of decisions about whether it would be allowed or not. We polled on that at the time. People really don't like Elon Musk, as we often poll on Elon Musk, and he has sort of one of the lowest approval ratings in the UK of any public figure. And at the time, people didn't think that donation should have been allowed. The challenge was when we asked a slightly different poll question and said, should the Labour Party ban this donation to reform the UK, rather than a specific general question of should a donation from Elon Musk to a party be disallowed. The public still, to be fair, in general, were fine. It was reform voters and it was the reforms sort of base of voters were much more sceptical. That wasn't a minority of the country at the time, so there was still widespread public support, but there is a challenge. If you're doing that sort of thing, you have to sort of contain the escalation, but it seemed to be a politically motivated thing rather than something that will sort of restrict the impact of big money more generally. I think Elon Musk is actually quite a good target for the government to take because he is so unpopular, and he's actually become much more unpopular since all that happened. But it's obviously a point of caution that it's one that reform will definitely try to weaponise.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I mean, I think this issue of like you can have a cap without it costing public funding is really important to say. Like, you set it at £1 or £2 million. I'd be interested in how that would fall. Like, but you have to, with the rationale, you can't have. Why does any party need more than that? Do you know what I mean? But that isn't going to be the transformative kind of participatory, giving the small people, donation to count. So, I mean, it does seem like that needs some, more of a deliberative process to get people on board with that. But I can't see why, I can't see that. I'll be interested in your views of it. Like, you put it like that. You get people to like, of course,
Yeah, it's so hard to call on numbers because people just, it's not necessary. But actually, that's one of the things where, even if trust in experts or something might be low with some groups, it's like people generally, they see the policy being announced, but the number is kind of generally fine on this sort of thing, I would say, would let other people keep up with that, I think.
I don't want us to run too late because I know we started late. Has anyone got any kind? Yeah, one question there.
Yeah, just a couple of quick ones. The attendance was limited, but the speaking seems to be in inverse proportion to its importance. Why do you think that is? I often read stories in Private Eye about first class financial journalists, but they never get beyond Private Eye because the mainstream media don't have any opinion on that.
Well, I mean, I can remember loads of peerages. That was in the mainstream media. Sorry to bring that up at a later conference, but that was in the mainstream media for quite a while. People working for Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister were, interviewed by the police about that matter. So sometimes these things bubble up from below the surface. Just as with MP's expenses in 2009, they appear to come out of nowhere, and then you can't get away from the story until finally someone has agreed to do something about it. And I just wonder, what scandal is going to finally cause the government to grasp the nettle on this issue. It was a previous Labour government that commissioned Sir Hayden Phillips to look into the question of donation caps. The Committee on Standards in Public Life, an independent body with representation from political parties on it, recommended over 15 years ago £10,000 per annum. And I remember sitting with politicians and officials in government trying to work out whether they could bring forward some kind of cap, because it had appeared in parties' manifestos. And I have to tell you that political parties of all colours struggle to engage with this issue without viewing it through the lens of, will that affect me more than my opponent, right? I mean, this is what I mean when I say they're conflicted, right? They are directly affected by the outcome, and therefore it's very hard for them to make an objective position, which is why we think it's helpful that we have bodies like the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which this government has just turned into the Ethics and Integrity Commission that it promised in its manifesto. So maybe we should actually empower some objective process here, rather than it just being a brokering between parties with competing interests. We, as I say, we recognise the integrity of the process which produced that recommendation from the Committee on Standards in Life some years ago. Liam says there's a body of opinion in the Parliamentary Labour Party that might want to do something on this. They're going to have a chance. We'll see what proposals appear in amendments from Labour MPs, and if you support this and you know any of your Labour MPs, then please let them know.
I don't want to run on any longer, so I'm going to close up, and I'm also going to abuse my position as chair to actually answer a little bit of the question about the interest or the coverage of this. I think there's a few different elements. I think one is that it's very complex. A lot of the stuff in the elections bill is quite dry, actually, when you get into the details of it. The other bit, I think, is that private eye obviously have a very different way of writing to the other sort of outlets. And then, as Peter will know, we have the luxury of a newsletter where we can throw in what we want. The difficulty is, many of these things don't break any rules. The rules are so wide that actually it's very difficult for you to be able to go to an editor and say, I want to write about this, because they'll turn around and say, well, what's the headline? Well, where's the rule breach that we can point to? So I think that's a big part of it as well. And just very finally, Liam is here. I don't know how many events like this are put on where no MPs want to come and talk about it, because all of the parties have the exact same problem. They're all relying on big money. None of them want to sort of cast the net so wide, because they will get caught up in it. I think, Sue, you actually said to me before the election, any party that wants to take anti-corruption and this stuff seriously is going to have to be very, very firm with it, because in the short term, they will make themselves look more corrupt. They will cast a light on the bad stuff that they have been doing in the past, and have to fess up to that as a way of saying, but now we're going to do a clean break. And it turns out that's slightly harder to do than maybe they expected. Listen, thank you all so much for coming. I'm sure we'll be hanging around if you want to ask us any questions otherwise. But last, I want to say thank you to my panel very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.